This review will be split into two parts, the first of which will cover my general thoughts and impressions relating to the content added with the DLC. This section will have very minor gameplay spoilers for the areas you will visit, but will not cover any aspects of the story, the bosses, secrets, or anything else within the DLC. The second part will be spoiler heavy, as I will be discussing in detail the story of Subject 2923, as well as Remnant as a game in its entirety, and what I took away from it as the final credits rolled on. I recommend you watch this one first and decide whether you want to play through the content before watching the spoiler review. You've been warned. Subject 2923 is the final DLC expansion for Remnant. It brings with it 2 new zones, a few new bosses, and the final chapter of the story of Remnant, finally bringing to a conclusion and putting an end cap on our journey as characters in the world. The first area we are presented with is another section of Earth that stands separate from the rest of the world we have unlocked so far. Because Subject 2923 stands as its own campaign within the game, these parts of Earth are not connected to the ones from the main game in any way. They mark the continuation of the end of what I will be referring to as Campaign 1. This was done, in my opinion, so that players did not have to play through the campaign once again in order to unlock the DLC content. Which I understand in theory, as that would have been fairly annoying for players who are part way through the main campaign, or who have restarted the main campaign and have not finished it on their current run. I have some minor gripes as to how this was done, but we will put those aside for now. It's worth making clear from the start that the Earth sections in the DLC are not actually sides locations. There are no boss rooms or expansive maps to work through. The purpose of the first outside locations is primarily to move you through the first sections of the story and get you to the place you are meant to be for the bulk of the gameplay that takes place. Despite the outside zones being mostly filler space with a few notable encounters, the tone and ambience of the place feels eerie and distinct when compared to the other parts of Earth we have visited before. In reality, this is just a secondary purpose of these areas, and it is something that Subject 2923 emphasizes to a higher degree than any other part of Remnant: tone and atmosphere. It becomes instantly apparent that this part of Earth is significantly different from anything else we have previously ventured through. There are no abandoned cities or complex underground tunnels here. In fact, we're out in the country, away from what we've grown accustomed to in our time on Earth. It's alien, new, and somewhat daunting. All that remains are broken machines, abandoned houses, and dead trees. A place that all the world has forgotten. There's a tonal shift I did not expect to come across when I first started. Things feel ominous. There is a real sense of foreboding and tension as you walk through the open fields, and the shattered forms of Root can be seen silhouetted against the mist. It's dramatic and oppressive. The desire to rush to the next location is halted, and a deep impression of isolation begins to creep its way into your mind. The area is quiet. A melancholic moon shines down, offering the only source of light. Gnarled trees, the shape of them the same as those of enemies you've been taught to worry about, lean painfully in the outskirts of your vision. For the first time, Remnant becomes a thrilling experience by the sheer atmosphere it presents, and without the need to cause panic with the overt danger of enemies. The Root are still here, but they're not the main antagonist anymore. The environment is, and it takes a second to realize it. Nothing of importance actually happens in the first area. You kill some Root, some hints are dropped about where the expansion is going, which was already spoiled by the trailer itself, and you move on. All of this culminates in a fairly engaging experience for what is ultimately just a long walk to get to the place that you need to go to progress the story forward. Over the course of the DLC, I was constantly nagged by the same issue, and I realize now that it had started with this section. The team did a good job establishing the new Earth areas. The sound design is up to par, and visually it stands on its own as a potentially emotional, impactful area. And there lies the problem. It had potential, but it was never used in any meaningful way. This is a problem that I kept running into over and over with this DLC, and it's something that I'm still struggling to come to grips with. The first areas establish a competent and unexpected tonal shift for the game from the first moments, but it never goes anywhere. You move through them and that's it. It's over, and all you're really left with is a bittersweet impression of something that was good, but that you really wish would have been used to a grander degree. It's a real shame, and it kind of permeates the entirety of the game. However, the DLC does start to offer some bright spots, and it all begins when we arrive at Ward Prime. After making our way through the open zones, we arrive at the actual point of the Earth section. Despite my hesitation to call this first part of the DLC a proper zone for the game, Ward Prime stands separately from any other single location in Remnant, and therefore it should be considered at the very least an important addition to the overall world. The base is a massive, isolated underground compound, and the art team have done a fantastic job at making it feel as such. The halls are empty and silent. Parts of the complex have been completely demolished by root growth. As you make your way through, following in the steps of those that came before you, you're struck by the immense weight that this place carries. This is where it all began. This is the birthplace of everything. The actions and decisions that were carried out here ultimately formed your reason for being a part of this story. This is the core point of the entirety of Remnant. Right here, and we finally get to step into it. Not only that, but this area adds what I consider to be one of the best aspects of the entire game. When you first make your way into Ward Prime, you will have that familiar sense of discovery. The same questions that every new zone poses will spring to mind. What sort of enemies will be here? What kind of loot will I find? But as you make your way down the twisted and dilapidated stairs, past the active crystal and into the main area, you quickly realize that there aren't any enemies. There are no bosses or mobs waiting for you. You are alone. For a moment, you can't quite believe it. Your map shows a massive, multi-leveled underground area. There is no way it can all be empty. You move through the corridors, and as you turn the corner, you spot a figure ambling towards you. The first time this happened, I instinctively aimed and fired at it, only to find that it was just an afterimage, and that it wasn't really there. As I watched it walk past me and further into the compound, the sinking realization finally settled in me. This is probably the biggest indoor zone in the entire game, yet there is no one here. Only you and the ghosts of the past. You start to make your way through the corridors, empty offices, and examination rooms, and it quickly becomes apparent that much of the facility is locked off, and you will need to figure out a way to bring it back to life and gain full access to the whole of Ward Prime. Here is the genius of this zone. The location itself is a complex and expanding series of rooms and locked doors, which you will need to move through by solving a number of environmental puzzles and picking out clues from the messages left behind by those that once called this place home. There are no waves of endless, persistent enemies on your heels making every step a hassle. You actually have to. You actually get to explore and learn about the place through investigation and puzzle solving in order to advance. Proper story is being told, and the game facilitates you learning it by having your natural progression through the area be an aspect of you unraveling that story. With each new room that is available to you, a new piece of the past as well as your way forward is unlocked. For the first time ever, the game is designed in a way where the story and gameplay are both delivered to you in an organic and engaging way, not by having NPCs exposit at you after having fought a few bosses, but by using the world itself to deliver the story it wants to tell. It's brilliant! It's a new kind of excitement that I never really felt in this game. I found myself thrilled when a new piece of the puzzle was solved, not because it meant a new boss or loot or even a new piece of lore, but because I had unlocked a bit more of the grand design of the place and the game's story. Each new clue that was solved, each new door opened became a reward in and of itself. It meant new parts of the story, new answers to uncover, while simultaneously moving me closer to the actual gameplay goal I needed to arrive at to progress. Even some fun side stories that don't directly impact the main picture became a joy to uncover. Despite them not being directly tied to the main story, they were glimpses of the past, of what it was like to live in this military compound in the years leading up to the Root invasion and after. I found myself sympathizing and connecting with some of the characters, people we never get to meet but that had more of a story to tell and a personality than even some of the voiced NPCs we interact with in the actual game. This is how discovery and exploration in a game should be done, as an implemented part of the experience. This style of game design stands in stark contrast to the rest of Remnant. While the majority of the game offers limited areas to sift through for information, and some of it is there if you look, there is no incentive to do so outside of your own desire to learn a bit more about the world and the game you are playing. The game never gives you a reason or even a path that leads you to natural discovery. In fact, you can simply run from boss to boss and finish the entire main game without ever having read a single scrap of paper. This is a huge fault with the base game. The fact that exploration is technically there, but it's hidden behind secondary and tertiary goals, puts to waste much of the wonderful world building the devs and writers have created for Remnant. Ward Prime presents a style of play that should have been in the game from the beginning, because it fits perfectly into the type of game that Remnant is. Having the gameplay progression be intertwined with the story of the game is a stroke of masterful design, and it is heartbreaking that it is not implemented until the last DLC. I love Ward Prime. It is by far my favorite area of Remnant, and the design within it is a beautiful display of storytelling. I just wish the reason I loved it so much wasn't for the fact that it's the only one of its kind. Maybe there'll be more of it in Remnant 2, I don't know. The other zone we will be exploring is a world called Razom. In short, it is a snow-covered themed area with a Norse architectural motif that really mixes well with the general tones of the game while also being separate enough to look and feel somewhat different. Razom is crafted in the same style as many other open zones in Remnant, with matching layouts and enemy behaviors. As you traverse through, you will find yourself fighting your average enemies with guns and melee weapons, flying enemies that throw bombs at you, and elites that will rush you or cast magic at you from far away. All of these feel and act very similarly to enemies you fought in other parts of the game. There is some individuality within the grander context of things though. For example, the big rat elites that will put up their shields to block attacks, so shooting them straight on isn't as effective. Small rats covered in bombs will rush at you and explode after a second, and even if you kill them, the body will still explode, so you can get caught off guard if you stand too close. There's even red barrels and plants that will cause small area damage around them when you shoot them, burning or freezing enemies that stand too close. These additions make a noticeable difference when moving through the zones, despite the fact that many of the enemies are just rat skin versions of those you faced in Yaesha. The novelty wore off after a little while though, and I found myself used to the mobs more quickly than I had in the past because in reality, they were ones I had already faced. There wasn't anything inherently unique about them, despite the superb visuals. This is not to cover the enemies and the environment they inhabit in the same stroke, because Razom itself as a zone is well crafted. I am a huge fan of the architecture and design. Having the outside areas be perpetually buffeted by howling wind and snow feels different, and walking through it gives a solid impression of the cold and bitterness that the inhabitants of this world must live with every day. The low visibility the snow enforces really adds to the tension of walking through any particular open area. You have to strain slightly to see enemies standing in the distance. Structures loom over you as rough silhouettes, and venturing into an unexplored part of the map is in itself a small exercise in bravery. Sometimes I would spot a mob and not realize that several more were already around me positioning to attack, simply because I hadn't seen them through the cover of the weather. I felt genuinely tense in parts of my first playthrough. This is multiplied greatly if you turn off your minimap during your first time, which I recommend. I remember entering a building that had a fire lit in one corner after having run through a fair bit of snow and wind, and physically feeling myself relax as my screen cleared and I was able to properly see in a place for once. It felt akin to coming into a warm home after having spent time outside in the cold. Much the same feeling my character must have had in-game. Going from a ravaging tundra full of enemies to a warm hut feels good, and that is something that can't be underrated. I was emotionally conflicted my first time through Razom, as I am now writing this review. Logically, I knew that I had been here before, in essence. That these were enemies I had fought countless times in prior zones, and that the real challenge would be found elsewhere. This took away the enjoyment of traversing through it a bit, as I was expecting a new zone to have at least some enemies that would behave and interact with me in a way unique to that zone. But at the same time, I was drawn in and absorbed into the world by the fantastic atmosphere and sense of being that that area possesses. It is probably the best set zone in the game when it comes to these aspects, and it is by no means a small accomplishment. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Razom feels like a compelling place to move through from an atmospheric standpoint, even if the bones of it are fundamentally the same as those we've seen before. This feeling doesn't extend past the first run through. Soon enough, you'll be smashing your way past enemies as you run from boss to boss. Speaking of, where Razom really comes into its own is with the bosses it offers. There are 5 bosses that you can encounter over the course of your journey through here, and they are, for the most part, pretty good. The design has been completely stepped up for this DLC, and it's nice to see. Not only is the general feel and style of them unique and attention-catching, but the fights themselves feature several new challenges that go beyond just having a massive health bar or powerful attacks to dodge or dragonheart your way through. Bosses have arena-appropriate hazards that pose a serious threat to you and can and will kill you if you aren't careful. Some adds and fights actually matter and are legitimate aspects of the fight that you need to focus on, instead of ignoring and focusing on the boss before they become a problem. The reason I'm not showing footage of the fights here is because frankly, I think the trailer itself already showed way more than was necessary, and if you haven't played through the DLC yet and are using this review as a marker for whether you should or not, I think it's important that you go into the fights fresh and without any prior knowledge because they will be much more enjoyable and fun that way. The takeaway here is that Razom has some of the best boss design in the entirety of Remnant. The Iskall Queen from the Courses update stands about the same level in my mind, but these are just better. It's fantastic having new and dynamic encounters for bosses that force the player to learn and react in ways they have little to no experience dealing with. It's just good game design. And it's fun. It's actually fun to have a new wall that you have to learn to overcome. They feel like actual challenges even in normal difficulty. And as someone who was basically maxed out his build, I can say that that's very welcomed. Some of them even have multiple phases to their encounters, which is something that is seen in other games, especially higher difficulty titles like Remnant, but that appear to be suspiciously absent from Remnant as a whole, barring a few final bosses. I get that you don't want all of your bosses to be like this, but in my opinion, the mechanic is greatly underutilized. Especially considering that there's many different ways that a boss fight can be changed in later stages. The creature models are also some of my favorites in the game. Remnant as a whole has really good boss character design. Each one has a unique look and feel that corresponds to the zone they belong to. Each one is instantly recognizable even if you don't know their names. I could put up a picture of just about any boss in the game and anyone who has fought them at least once will immediately recall what their fights consist of. Razom steps it up just a bit more and has some of the coolest and most imaginative ones I personally think have been added to the game since its inception. I mean, look at this thing. It's a massive rat man riding on an even bigger rat horse thing. This one has 2 spiked shields, no weapons, just 2 shields that he uses to bash you endlessly as he jumps around like the Hulk in his arena. How could you possibly not find this cool? It's like if Master Splinter from the Ninja Turtles started a secret clan of warrior rats, moved to Norway, and became brutal Vikings. With bombs! Most of the bosses are also supplemented by the newly introduced status effect, Frostbite. While frozen, your movement speed, roll speed, and stamina regeneration are all reduced. You also get covered in a big block of ice that clings to you until you either use a consumable to remove it, or stand near a big fire, which will melt it away. The encounters make clever use of this new status effect. All of them have at least one way to inflict you with the condition, and once this happens, a fight can go from manageable to insanely difficult in a few quick moments. More than once did I find myself being rushed by the boss, my stamina depleted, my body frozen, and my health bar about to be cut down in chunks as I hopelessly prayed for enough energy to roll out of harm's way. If I ever got here, I was dead, and in turn I found myself actively using consumable items to assist in fights that were too difficult, or that I was still too unfamiliar with to complete without. I've never felt the need to do this with any other encounter, but here it felt like the appropriate and smart thing to do. Like I was going in prepared for what I knew would come, and like the game knew that this would be the case, and so it scaled up the difficulty of the encounter from the start, because it expected me to use the consumables to balance it out. I'm probably giving too much credit to the game itself, but it was an enjoyable and interesting experience that I can't recall having anywhere else in Remnant. The bosses are just good. They're enjoyable and challenging, and for a game where you will be running to them a lot, that is not something to be taken lightly. The loot of the game is also relatively good. It's what you come to expect from the game at this point. There's nothing completely mind-blowing, but there are some fun weapons to play with and stuff that will supplement your continuous playthrough in the future. As a whole, the expansion is more of Remnant. You can take that to be a good thing or not. Subject 2923 is arguably the best expansion the game has had, especially considering it will be its last. Do take that statement with a grain of salt. The other DLC was essentially a fix for parts of the game that were unfinished at release. In reality, this DLC feels much the same as that. It feels like a part of the game that should have come out at release, but instead was packed separately for some reason. I was left with a somewhat bitter taste in my mouth at the end of it. Like I had gotten a really good bite of something delicious, and then it was taken away from me as I was starting to enjoy it properly. It finally finishes the story, in a broad sense, and wraps a nice, if somewhat half-hearted bow on all of our adventures up to this point. If you put that aside, however, there is enough in the DLC to enjoy, especially when it comes to combat and gameplay. And for the low price of $10, there's worse things you can spend your money on. The new zones are well crafted, if a bit samey, and the boss fights and subsequent loot are engaging, entertaining, and add just enough freshness to the game to be worth the price of admission. If you followed Remnant up to this point, you would be doing yourself a disservice by skipping out on this DLC. If you're new to the game, maybe wait until a bundled deal comes out that offers all of the game and DLCs together, or for a Steam sale. I have a lot more to say on the state of the story, the DLC, and Remnant as a game overall, so I will be making a separate video because frankly this one is getting out of hand. There I will be covering my views on the game, the story, the interactions that we've had, and everything up to this point, main game and all. If you're interested in that, there will be a link here when it's available. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support that I've gotten lately, and it's very encouraging as I go forward. You guys are fantastic, and I have no words, so thank you. If you're new and would like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe if you haven't already, and check out some of the other Remnant videos if you have a chance.